Welcome to the Draft Deeper podcast. This is your host, Nathan Grubel. Joining me, as always, is my producer, Kevin Black. We're on a roll here over at the Draft Deeper podcast, back-to-back weeks with incredible guests. Last week, in case you missed it, we had Chad Ford on for Chad Ford's NBA Big Board, going over some big board comparisons, early on insights. But this week, I am honored to join by author of the new book, The Midrange Theory, Seth Partnow. Seth, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. It's very weird to get introduced as someone being honored to talk to me because we're just talking about basketball here, and I don't know. It was a lot of work, but it still doesn't feel that serious. I'm not like a mayor or something. So anyway, sorry, didn't mean to.
Then tell that to all the people who privately messaged me and were like, "Holy crap, you're having Seth on! Like that's amazing." So then tell that to those people too. You are a respected person in the industry here. So don't sell yourself short, my friend. So for my audience, Seth, in case for whatever reason they haven't heard of you, which I'd be shocked if they didn't or they haven't seen some of your work, can you just give a brief introduction into who you are and what you've done in your career and where everyone can also find and read your work apart from purchasing the Midrange Theory?
Sure. So, I guess the relevant portion is that around 8 years ago, I started writing about basketball at my own website and then a website called Nylon Calculus from a primarily an analytical standpoint. I do have a background playing basketball, but I've always sort of approached sports from a numerical perspective. I was for people of a certain age, I was the kid who kept stats on RBI baseball when I was playing it as a kid. You know, before Nintendo games had the battery that like saved stats, you had to do it anyway. But I started writing about basketball from a sort of a statistical lens. You know, the first season that the NBA had tracking data, which was 2013-14, available to the public, and sort of from that, I got noticed by some folks and started having discussions with teams, and eventually I got hired as the director of basketball research by the Milwaukee Bucks in 2016. I spent 3+ seasons there. Then I left to join The Athletic in 2019, where I still write and podcast occasionally. And I have recently also joined on as an advisor to a company called StatsBomb, which has heretofore been a producer of soccer data, but is now moving into primarily North American sports, focused right now on American football. So you can find me on Twitter at Seth Partnow. The handle is Anchorage Man because I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska. So I think that is the summary. That is the elevator pitch.
That's an excellent summary at that. So I have to ask the most general question I can, the cookie cutter question. Everybody's probably asked it to you 25 times, but I got to do it on my podcast. Why did you choose to write the book on the topics that you did?
So it was sort of interesting. A lot of times when people write a book, they have the book and they pitch it around. And I was lucky enough that it was sort of the other way around. It was the publisher said, "Hey, write a book." And so then I had to come up with it. I had sort of come up with the topic. And something I realized is, I guess the analogy is sort of for a band, the first album is sort of a lifetime in the making. It's all your best songs you've ever written. And it's a little bit of that. I've researched basketball a lot over this last decade, and a lot of it hasn't been exposed to people because some of the foundational stuff I wrote on our website that 50 people read. So kind of going back and getting back to those roots and kind of expanding on it, using kind of what I've learned in the interim and bringing it to hopefully a wider audience. It was sort of the thought process behind it. There's a lot of topics involved. I think the book is topical rather than narrative driven. I didn't want to try to write Moneyball for basketball because I'm not Michael Lewis, and as much as he has inspired a lot of us, like knowing one's own limitations is important. But I did and just from a standpoint of writing a book that's sort of just what I think, and not having to, even though I did talk to people for the book, it was not like driven by a story that it weaved through. Because the way I look at analytics isn't really a one big idea kind of thing. I think it's number of smaller ideas, and I think breaking it up sort of fits with how I think that a statistically based approach can sort of impact the game. Is a lot of improvements in little topics rather than sort of one big aha.
And what was so interesting about your book, I do have some questions here that we'll get into that I've tried to frame around the draft and scouting, because that's really what this podcast is. But for anybody, I seriously strongly encourage everyone to go out and buy this book and read it, because it truly was awesome to read all the chapters, all the sections you have that are really like history building in a sense. Like, you go over trends that have emerged and presented themselves over the last 15 to 20 years, and you did it in such depth and detail. And it was a thrilling read for me. I'm glad I was able to sit down the last few days and read it. I won't spoil a lot of stuff in the book, including the specific chapter you have titled The Midrange Theory, which really explains, I would feel, a lot of why you wanted to write the book the way that you did. But I want to start. So you say so yourself up front in your book that you hate what the word analytics has become, and that all of the charts, graphs, equations you could present to readers, at the end of the day, we're just talking about basketball, right? It's just basketball. So in your best words, what is your best definition of what that word should mean, and how those in the community should actually view the word analytics when they're talking about basketball?
If honestly, if it was up to me, we just would start over and come up with different terminology, because the word is so sort of hopelessly bastardized. It's like in sort of the broader consciousness, it's like basic. It too often means, hey, the nerd said shoot more threes, and that's both wrong and reductive, but at the same point, I just don't want to have that argument anymore. So I would just pick a different. I would just pick a different kind of term to begin with, and also like putting a specific terminology on it in almost necessarily like separates it from basketball. There's like these people are doing basketball and these people are doing analytics, and they're not the same thing.
Yep.
And I don't believe that. I think that that's all basketball. It's not. You can scout with numbers just like you can scout with your eyes. You can do analysis with your eyes just like you can with numbers. And putting sort of an artificial barrier between those through the use of terminology is an impediment to sort of better understanding, whether it's just for enjoyment of the game or in a more directed kind of professional sense, making decisions. I wrote a lot of the book sort of from the standpoint of, I think I termed it the fantasy GM standpoint.
Yep.
Because a lot of sort of the public, and I have to use the word because we don't have another one, but a lot of the public analytics sort of discussion is focused on that sort of the roster construction and in-game strategy and contract and those kind of things. So that's the sort of the venue that most people are familiar with applying these concepts. So that is the standpoint which I focused on primarily in the book.
So fairly early on in your book, you talk about Dean Oliver's 4 pillars, which 2 of the 8 refer to offensive and defensive rebounding percentage. And in trying to pick out some questions that I find relevant to scouting, rebounding has become something that's not viewed as an overly positive indicator for prospects transitioning to the league as much anymore. Rebounding specialists have kind of gone to the wayside, while they may pile up numbers. Like Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky this year, for example, is a guy that I've already gotten tweets about this season. Like, is he a prospect? Where should he be on big boards? And we don't actually consider those guys NBA prospects in the same way like we used to, or other players who have a more or others who have
Vanderbilt is the counterpoint I would come with there. Is a guy who was just like, obviously was hurt a lot his 1 year at Kentucky, but like just absurd rebounding like numbers, like scale breakingly absurd rebounding numbers.
Well, so that's what I was going to say, that like, bigs who can effectively rebound the ball on both ends, like generally they find a way to make themselves in the NBA rotations, though. Even though we might not view them as these sexy prospects, they find ways to make contributions in the NBA. So like, how should we as scouts evaluate rebounding, and like, what are some indicators we should better understand and remind ourselves of when we're determining importance and context versus just looking at like rebounds per game?
But I think it's you start to look at rebounding percentages, and then you do have to have a little bit of sort of a contextual understanding, relative to position. If a guy is, a guy has a 25% like defensive rebounding rate, but he's a guy who's going to play the 3 in the NBA and he's playing the 5 in college, it's maybe not, because that's for NBA prospects that play center, that's actually kind of below average. If it's a guy who projects as a 2 who's doing that while playing on the perimeter, then you might have, okay, this guy has something that's allowing him to just get the ball like a lot more than most people in his sort of general profile does. So that's maybe that's athleticism, maybe that's feel and anticipation. Maybe it's poor competition, which you also have to sort of take into account. That's part of why the draft is the statistical, just like any analysis of the draft, a statistical approach is much more art than science, because you can kind of adjust formally to some degree for quality of competition, but that still is only so much. Like there's only so much you can sort of guess at. Okay, well he's the most athletic player in the MAC. Where does that fit relative to So, I that didn't really answer your question, because there isn't an answer to your question. There's no sort of one size fits all to a lot of these things. It's all heavily contextual, and the modeling we do is I think much more about ruling players out than it is about like pointing to guys and saying that guy. You know what I mean? People who have poor statistical performance usually don't make it. People with good statistical performance, it's no guarantee. It just sort of means they have a chance. And you kind of dig in, and it's like, okay, this guy's got great numbers, but he's a 6'4" slow power forward. So nah. The sort of, since he was one of the guys who was a statistical marvel in like one of my first draft classes with the Bucks, is the Jameel Warney test. Kind of, it's like, is that going to work at the next level? And it's like, okay, well, if he becomes a 38% 3-point shooter from NBA range, then yeah, maybe he's got a place. But okay, that's a guy I would prefer a EuroLeague team to discover if he's that guy, rather than use draft capital on.
Sure. So not long in your book, after your section that you talked about rebounding a little bit, you did go into one about playmaking and adjusting what was once used for determining the level of how efficient a playmaker was off of assist to turnover ratio. In your book, you talk about an adjusted formula that takes potential assists into account, as well to deviate away from only measuring if a player avoided adding to the turnover percentage, right? So I'm curious where you fall on the evaluation of a specific player, Cade Cunningham, in that aspect. Because if you just look at his assist to turnover ratio going back to college, that was a hot debate about, is he actually a good passer? If he's having like 5 assists to 3 turnovers in college. And even now, the results, they weren't in some aspects, they aren't promising for someone who's continuously billed as a gifted passer and someone who is looked at as a viable offensive engine, not just a shooter or scorer. Where do you fall on him in that regard? I'm curious.
Who's he playing with? I mean, no, like, there's guys who have.
It's a valid question to ask. No, Oklahoma State, valid question.
Yeah, no, but in Oklahoma State was there's been prospects who have played with mediocre players around them and still managed to do. But he didn't just have mediocre players around him. He had like specifically mediocre players, like guys who both couldn't shoot and wanted to play with the ball in their hands. So it wasn't, first of all, guys just missed shots. Second of all, like, it's hard to track record scratches per 100 or whatever. But I have to think that some of the other perimeter guys on that Oklahoma State team would be pretty high on he's throwing the ball to Isaac Likely would like to handle the ball and do some stuff. So Cade would break someone down, draw help, kick to the corner, and then it's not that the shot would be missed; it just wouldn't go up.
Yep.
So on that level, the potential assists almost don't happen, even though like that should be a shot. He did. What more do you need him to do? Now this may seem like special pleading a little bit, but I think that this was a an unusual circumstance for a guy to be like that pedigree to play in a power conference. So the level of competition he's playing against is pretty high, with that much of a dearth of talent around him, and that talent around him not only doesn't complement him, it kind of actively blocks him. And unfortunately for him, like relative to the NBA, the situation isn't that much different in Detroit. I mean, there's not a lot of shooting around him. Like, Jeremy Grant is a ball stopper. Sadiq Bey is trying to explore the studio space this year a little bit, and he's trying to understandably perhaps expand beyond a catch and shoot guy. Doesn't do Cade any favors. And then he's often sharing the floor with another nominal point guard. So again, these are you can go overboard with kind of contextual understanding in a way that becomes excuse making, but I don't have much of a problem seeing him as a potential offensive engine still. Like, there things that he can work on. Yeah. Is his handle a little bit loose? Can he become a better finisher on the basket? Does he need to play a little stronger with the ball? Yes, these things I think are all, from an observational standpoint, you'd say yeah. But I'm still not really worried, I guess.
Neither am I, and it's one of those things that a lot of people are asking this question, and it's not even Christmas yet. Like, first of all, he didn't even start out playing, from the jump of the season. He was injured coming in. He missed the first few games, and he's had to come up to speed with a brand new cast of teammates. And you pointed out that not exactly all of them are lighting it up as catch and shoot guys. So I agree. It's a little too early, and that I'm assuming that that's your full opinion on it, right? You would still give him the chance to kind of be the point guard of the team.
And also, he's been. We actually on my podcast Nerdish Hero, we actually talked about this today, or like with James Edwards, the beat writer from the Pistons, and the way I put it is that he's kind of there's some players where you listen to the singles of the album and you get an idea, and he's an album cuts guy. Like, you don't always get the full, this guy is good, just from like watching the ends of plays and stuff like that. He does a lot of like little subtle things that make you think, okay, this guy knows what he's doing and he's gonna be okay. Like, yes, he's gonna, the team around him is gonna get better, and he's gonna get physically more mature. Like, he's gonna, like, getting stronger. Being an NBA weight program is something
that's to me, that's the biggest thing that's holding him back right now.
Like, I think that's like he has a frame that should add strength. Although something I learned today is that he's apparently a vegan, which how that impacts adding strength, I don't know. But yeah, so there are things you can see that need to be improved, but it's also, you take the whole of his game and you just have to be impressed. Now, that doesn't mean you're not more impressed at this point by Evan Mobley, who, you had every player, you have questions coming in about, can they or can't they? And like, yeah, some of the questions about Cade are still questions. Like, his little bit of a loose handle, top line athleticism may be lacking. Evan Mobley, aside from the jump shot from deep still being a little wonky.
Yeah, please actually talk about him, because I didn't come into this podcast expecting to ask you about specific players necessarily, but he is a guy who broke a lot of statistical models last year in terms of his efficiency in college.
But there is a little bit you worry about, like, what is he? Like, was not a great rebounder in college. Some of that's contextual. Mm-hmm. He was playing in a too big system. His brother was really the interior workhorse on that team, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Correct.
But the thing, like, okay, is he going to be a 5? He's a little light, doesn't rebound great. Is he going to be a 4? Does he have the lateral movement? Because the very, very tall guys with high hips, sometimes you worry about lateral movement, and that's a question that's been answered. It's been answered, like, he's gonna be fine. And then just his obviously his defensive feel is so advanced. So while you're still giving Cade time, like, Mobley has already checked those boxes that you didn't know what it was. So if you're going to do a redraft now, like, yes, you take Mobley because he's demonstrated some of he's answered some of the questions in a positive way already, whereas Cade just hasn't fully answered them either way. Now, it doesn't mean that you want to completely write off the fact that Mobley will definitely be the better player. I think in 3 years we might revisit this and think differently. But just he's shown himself to be more advanced at this point than relatively than Cade is, and that maybe that's the bar just being in a different place positionally. But at the same time, I think that you talked about I talked about the context Cade is in. Playing with another mobile big who can handle like more of the traditional like bang with the big guys duties, like Jared Allen. Yep. That's been huge. Like we thought that would be a problem for him, perhaps. Like they'd maybe get in each other's way, and it hasn't worked out that way. It's been almost a perfect synergy between the two, and that's that
was that just kind of more the misconception of like 2 7-footers shouldn't be sharing the court with each other as much nowadays, because like Mobley was very perimeter oriented going back to college. Like he really didn't want to operate from like the free throw line in. He kind of stayed back from the free throw line. So like maybe it's just the whole 2 7-footers notion. Maybe
I mean it was as much defensively with the NBA going to like small switchy lineups, especially if you're worrying about Mobley's like lateral quickness. Like, okay, his lateral quickness is fine for a center who maybe switches some. We didn't know. I don't think we knew that it was like, oh, see, he can play the 4 and chase guys too, and then still recover and be like a weak side rim protector. That's the part that's been obviously more advanced than we could have reasonably expected. And that's a big part of why it's worked. And then also, like I think, a lot of people sort of undersold how good Jared Allen is, and he's improved a lot. Also, I mean, I think he at this point, if they did All-Star ballots now, I think he would make the Eastern Conference All-Star team. And I don't think anyone would have predicted that before the season. But I think we underestimated him perhaps a little bit too. And he's always been a player that I think who had a higher skill level than he was necessarily given credit for. Like there these kind of dive and dunk bigs who can actually like handle the ball and make a play that we don't always give credit for such because maybe they don't have good assist totals. Robert Williams is another player like that who can kind of catch the ball in space and make a play, so is able to operate in a more versatile manner than say like a Clint Capella is.
Yep.
But I digress. We were talking about Cade, and I don't know how we got to Jared Allen. Here we are.
Well, we got to Cade, then we went to Evan Mobley, then we went to Jared Allen and the Cavs, who are one of the best watches in the league this year. God, that team is. I was a year too early on that bandwagon. I thought that last year would be a year where they could outperform expectations, and then injuries just derailed that team the whole 9 yards. But now you bring in Mobley, Okoro's all of a sudden like making like scoring 18 points per game, and Garland has taken the leap. And God, I love that team. But let's move on. So we were actually talking about the impact that a good player playing with not so good players can have on somebody entering the draft. So I actually want to skip ahead to this question. So many times the evaluations on players are weighted by a few games against certain opponents versus not taking a look at the larger sample size overall. And the hot topic right now in draft circles would be Patrick Baldwin. So very prominent example of this happening as scouts are likely going to weigh his lack of impact against Florida, Colorado, and now Rhode Island this week, much more than any game he'll play in conference in the Horizon League the rest of the year. So how fair is that criticism, and where do you personally sit on the fence of context and a player's performance and trying to factor in some of the outside factors that can contribute to that as well, like that lack of on-court success?
I mean, I think that probably or if he's a draft like a first round draft prospect, he is too good for the Horizon League. Like that's and if he's not too good for the Horizon League, then that's a problem. So him like dominating in those games is almost table stakes. So then you have to like, is he beating up on on lesser competition, or does he have like the top end stuff to hang against the elite teams, which are also the teams that have closer to NBA size and athleticism, and the failure to do so is worrisome. I mean, I think it's couple 3 games the first month of his freshman year. That doesn't determine everything, but it's something you worry about. And maybe hopefully they can make the tournament and play high level competition again at the end of the season, and then there might be maybe that's only a game or two, but then does it look better than maybe it has at some points? Like the I didn't see the Rhode Island game, but I heard it was not pretty for him.
It was not another statistical donut burger.
Yeah, well, and it's not it's not just you want to separate that kind of performance, like did he make shots or not, versus how did he get shots. And that's again, by our reports, that was the bigger kind of eye opener in the negative way, was just inability to create separation. And it's Rhode Island. It's not we're not talking about a stacked Kentucky team that he's not able to do that against. Like, it's a fine team, but it's not a lot of NBA pros on that roster either. So that's worrisome. You can't on that.
There's just something funky going on with that team, and I can't quite put my finger on it yet. I have a theory that hopefully I'll revisit at one point on this podcast, but I definitely wanted to get your input on something like that. So you wrote an entire chapter about the draft in your book. That's a big reason why, obviously, I wanted to have you on this podcast. And the mixed results the draft has produced over the years, there are so many factors at play, but I do want to get your opinion on this. So you mentioned Habistro's study specifically in the book, and the question asked from it of, are teams getting worse at the draft? When in reality, I think maybe it's better to ask if the focus of evaluations has been put far too much on the long-term projection of prospects and not enough focus on who they are now as basketball players, and finding better ways to get them involved in a rotation to get them minutes to develop the other skills. And there's other factors that you even talked about in the book, off-court behavior, medical, etc. But do you think maybe that's the better question that we should be asking?
So it's complicated because this is sort of a question that's almost a meta question that sits on top of draft strategy. Is what are you aiming for?
Yep.
If you're, if you are a pretty good team that's looking to take the next step, maybe you like getting a guy who's going to be a good 3-and-D guy, or a serviceable 3-and-D rotation guy. Maybe that's really what you're trying to do. If you're a team that's on the way up, that's fine, but you're really aiming at the right tail of distribution. Like that's, like people are bemoaning Oklahoma City kind of in their continual tankage, right? Shai Alexander's pretty good, but Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is not, and at this point, I think it's fair to say, is unlikely to be a top 5, top 10 type player in the NBA. And if you're a team that's starting from nothing, that's what you're aiming for. So, kind of, almost who cares? Like if a guy is like ready to play now, and it's not, you're aiming for. You're aiming for like what if he hits his 90th percentile outcome is going to make us almost de facto a contender. That's what if you're in that spot, that's what you're drafting for. And then for the teams that are already really good, already championship level, like maybe then you're looking for someone who can step in right away. Although I think that's generally speaking a misnomer. Rookies tend to just be not good enough to contribute to playoff teams. Personally, I think a team that is already at a championship level should never make their own draft pick. Basically, I think you always do better by moving it for a guy who can play now. But the alternatively, like you're basically trying to pick someone who's going to at least maintain value while he's not playing, because if Cam Thomas is getting playing time for the Nets. Um, I would say that in not ideal circumstance, like the Nets would prefer not to be in a situation where Cam Thomas has to get minutes, and he's done fine with those minutes. But um, if things are right with that team, there's just he's going to be buried, you know. And so is this guy intriguing enough that if we want to make a move, he's a guy that we'll take a shot on him. Is he, you know, like R.J. Hampton was a big part of the Aaron Gordon trade last year, despite not playing very much for Denver beforehand. And I think that's sort of the type you're aiming for. So, in so I'm not a big fan, I guess, of aiming for trying to hit singles and doubles. Generally speaking, I think is if I'm going to summarize that that soliloquy into one thing. I think that, like, you know, you can find, like, those are the guys you can find after they've proven that they're good. There's sort of there's a piece of wisdom I about, you know, contract negotiations in hockey that I think applies here, which is, you know, some smart people say, like, you never give long-term contracts to third and fourth liners, because if you got to give money out to a first and second liner over a number of years, that's fine, because even if they're a little bit worse, they're still third and fourth liners. Like a third or fourth liner who is a little bit worse than you thought he was is not an NHL player, and now you're stuck with him. So why are you aiming for kind of a seventh man with your draft pick? You know, if you miss, he's nothing. You know, if you're aiming higher, then yeah, you still miss and you could be nothing. But if you miss just a little bit, then he falls into that sort of seventh, eighth man rotation category, and you still have the chance at the higher end outcomes, which is really where, just by operation of the salary cap, where the value of draft picks typically is.
So in talking about the value of draft picks, I actually wrote this down as a question because you have another chapter in your book dedicated to cap and player value. The draft, in my opinion, can be a boon in roster construction if done properly, and I think Desmond Bane is a great example of that. Somebody in Memphis who is on a rookie contract but clearly is providing great value as a starter caliber guard who was selected at the end of the first round. So I guess more of like a historical or type of question. When do you think like that shift happened in front offices in regards to putting more emphasis and value behind first round picks? Because you get the feeling now more than ever they seem to hold much more value as assets in general, right? Like there seems to be that shift the last like 3-4 years. Not everyone's coming up with all these crazy trades where we're trying to throw in a bunch of first round picks unless we're getting like a guaranteed superstar back in return. Because maybe even if you're not the upper echelon of a contender, maybe you can use a pick like that at the end of the first round to get somebody like a Desmond Bane, add a quality player to a rotation.
Wow, that's like 4 different questions at once. So like Desmond Bane is an interesting one. So there are players of, you know, various archetypes that work. Now the thing is, you know, how many Desmond Bane-ish prospects have there been that don't? And so we tend to focus on the ones that make it, and not, you know, and not sort of do the calculation of, okay, of this type of player, how many of them are good by their second or third year? If we do that and come up with that calculation, yeah, maybe there was something discernible about Desmond Bane that put him on a higher level than that sort of archetype of player. And, you know, you can certainly make the argument for that. But I do think it is sometimes a flaw, sort of post hoc evaluation of the draft. It's like, well, that guy worked out. It's like, well, yeah, some like one-dimensional scores are going to, and not that this is Desmond Bane, but different player type. Some sort of one-dimensional high-volume scores are going to be good enough at that they're a valuable NBA player. Most won't. I've always sort of been, at least with picks sort of higher up the draft, I'm okay missing out on that. Like, okay, 1 in 10 of, we'll pick a number, 1 in 10 of them is going to make it. I'll let someone else figure out which one it is, and I'll go a different direction where there's more of maybe a better bet. So that's, you know, why a guy like Desmond Bane like falls, like, you know, for every Desmond Bain, how many Aaron Neesmiths are there? I guess is sort of the way you could almost look at it from that draft.
Sure. So another interesting question that I wanted to ask: these last two drafts, at least on the surface, albeit incredibly early to properly judge, seem to have been loaded with potential starter level contributors on NBA teams. And even if that does bear out to be the case, when we look back a few more years down the road, that's usually not the trend. When you go back and look at virtually every other draft in history, the game seems to be the most successful that it's ever been when you factor in the outside shooting craze, the sports science developments that have occurred to help prolong players' careers through injuries, the positive trend in athleticism amongst players nowadays. Do you think we're in the midst of this type of era where we're going to start to see a larger influx of potential starter level talent? Or do you think the last few years are outliers and that's not really a trend that should be expected to continue? And I'll say the reason why I'm asking that question is because like draft Twitter is always a buzz, right? They're naming out like 30 to 45 to 50 guys should be like first round caliber picks, right? Like all these crazy talented players. When usually that's not the case. That's not how history bears out.
Optimism bias is a hell of a drug. No, I think yes, some classes are going to turn out better than others, but I don't think that there's a considering it's sort of it's all relative. There's no like standard of quality that is
Sure.
always a starter. Like, it's maybe it's as much a function as the players kind of shaking out at the other end in terms of how many spots there are. If we're in a particular spot where a higher than normal number of kind of rotation players are either aging out or retiring from that sort of, then just naturally more younger players are going to fill in, and that's sort of exogenous to the almost the quality of the draft class itself. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing is just the one group of kids might have avoided injuries better, might have found better college programs, better AAU programs to develop their skills in an NBA sort of facing way than another group. And I think there's enough kind of randomness in that whole process that and then of course there's kids like whether players like whether it's Cade, who are able to develop in an imperfect environment, or like John Morant, who's able to develop against a lower level of competition. There are some outliers like that, but for the most part, there's a lot of it's sort of a lot of individual decisions sort of aggregate to determine like the overall success, I guess, of a draft class. And I don't see any particular reason to think that the underlying math of how many spots there are opening each year is going to change much, if that makes sense. Like
no, it does.
The trends here. Like if anything, it should be like if like the sports science is genuinely like prolonging primes and careers, then you should almost expect like almost lower success rates, just because with lower turnover in the spots. Now we're talking, well, there's this draft class has 15 rotation spots to fill instead of 20. So but I think there's, generally speaking, there's a draft class will produce 20-ish rotation guys, of which 5 will be high end starters, of which of those 3 will be all stars, of which maybe 1 will be like a franchise level superstar. Like maybe every third draft or so you'll get one of those, just on average. And I don't really see that math changing, because the composition of the league hierarchy has been pretty stable over time in terms of it's one of the bigger projects I do for The Athletic every year is my player tiers. And part of the reason that the tiers are the size they are is that's a pretty persistent sort of stratification of the league, like top 5 players, top 15 players, top 40 players, top 70. Like those are some natural cut points we kind of see year after year. And, the classes filling in from the draft sort of reinforce that almost. And that's the range of outcomes that we tend to see.
Fair enough. I hope that Hope that I haven't upset you too much.
Did I rain on parades there that says that this draft class is like? There's also, I mean, this is also like every draft class. It starts, like a year ago. I don't know about this draft class, and then by February, it's like, the draft class is pretty good. There's about 60, 70, 80 guys who can play. It's like, yeah, but most of them won't be able to. Like, that's just how it kind of works out. And it's
no, because that's usually the side of the argument I'm on too, though. Like, I'm doing this evaluation of trying to give every prospect their fair shake, and I tend to be more positive and optimistic when I'm actually talking about specific evaluations of the player and outcomes and what they can be. But when you look at it through the lens of what's more likely to happen than not, a lot of these guys are not going to work out in that favor in terms of being a starter in the NBA. You'll have a number that will be starters, and as you mentioned, fewer numbers of that will be all stars. Fewer numbers than that would be a franchise-changing player. There are a number who can be role players. Like, there are spots 6 through 15 to fill out an NBA roster for each team, but the likelihood of being a starter, it's very hard to determine. And I'm sure you doing work in the draft, I'm sure some of those questions you kind of get annoyed having to answer them or find answers to them over and over again.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a tough balance because on one hand, like, less players will make it than we think will.
Yep.
We tend to, but more players have a chance to than we think will also. So it's sort of you know, like, it's not just the top 20 players in the draft that made it. There's probably like 60 guys who get drafted and then 25 more who all have like some degree of chance of being like a reasonable and like rotation level NBA player. And yeah, what the actual and sort of unknowable percentage of that is will vary and will decline pretty steeply after the first 5-10 picks. But those that there are a lot of players. So the things that people are seeing about all these players about why they might make it aren't wrong. It's just almost the context of what like level of output, what like where on the distribution of possible outcomes this player will have to be to make it. I think that's the part that gets underestimated. Like, yeah, there's 80, 90 guys who could be, but most of them would have to hit like 75th percentile outcome or higher. So like, and that's what makes it tricky, because you're like, yeah, you're right, that guy could make it, but he probably won't, just law of averages. So how do you maintain the optimism to keep trying to find these guys, knowing most of them will, for lack of a better term, fail? Is that sort of it necessitates almost like an irrational exuberance. And you don't want to kill that from the people who are doing the evaluation, but sort of the meta evaluation, sort of the contextualizing of all these these evaluations that come in to ultimately make the decision. You kind of have to mentally scale it back a little bit, because he's not wrong to like this guy. He just is not properly calibrated as to what the potential he's seeing means.
So scouting itself, the NBA draft is as imperfect of a science as there is. I'm probably crazy to want to continue to pursue something like this for a career, but call me crazy. I just love it too much. But you obviously have a lot of experience studying the game, and obviously you have accumulated at least a better understanding as to popular indicators that can lead to more educated decisions on who to draft, albeit there's so many factors that we could talk about, obviously. But what are one or two things that scouts like myself should pay closer attention to when we're evaluating prospects that we might overlook, or maybe we don't put as much stock into? There any tips that maybe you could give scouts like me on evaluating guys?
Be very wary of buying non-functional athleticism. Like, they're a tremendous if a guy's a tremendous run and jump athlete and he blocks a shot every third game, what's going on there? He's got 6'9", long arms, and has blocked 4 shots all season. There's a disconnect there. Now maybe it's maybe there's something going on. Maybe like he's playing, the top of a zone or something like that, and so therefore just doesn't get as many chances to do that. But at the same time, it's like you have to ask yourself if he's got this physical talent that's not manifesting itself in like, production, quote unquote, on the floor, and from a statistical standpoint, why not? Like if he could play, it would show up, and that's sort of the sort of the basis of using statistical projections is like, the guy who's going to be better tomorrow was probably better yesterday too.
Mm-hmm.
And better is imperfect, but the stats tell us something. How players get to these, they both, playing time tells us who the coach thinks can play. That's not an indicator that is absent that signal. He ends up with some steals, some blocks, some rebounds. He's got a nose for the ball. Whether that's, whether that's sort of mental quickness and anticipation or kind of being twitchy. Like you do have to kind of parse that out a little bit, but there's something going on that's allowing this person to either be in the right place early or get there faster than the competition to be able to make these plays. So that's what we're identifying here, and sort of not getting fooled by sort of the quote unquote visible potential that doesn't like show up in actually doing things.
That was a fantastic answer to that question. And I definitely feel smarter being able to listen to you, Seth, and ask you some of these questions because they did pop up while I was reading your book. I can't, if I could sit down and have a discussion with you about everything in the book, I certainly would, but I don't think we'd have enough time to do that. I don't think you want to talk about or rehash some of the things either. Like your chapter on defense, I could tell you were aggravated just writing all of that stuff out. But it was insightful nonetheless. And, oh, you say you look like you're going to have an answer for that. Go ahead.
I mean, defense is hard to write about because it's hard to evaluate. That actually wasn't, frankly, honestly the more painful parts to write were, well, first of all, the chapter on like adjusted plus minus methodology was hard to write just because that's a that is easily the densest chapter in the book, and there's kind of no way around that given the subject matter. And so that was hard to write, just to try to make it both intelligible and accurate at the same time. But then frankly, the title chapter is very hard to write just because there's so much to pack in there, and to get that to tell like a consistent story was actually, that was the last chapter I finished because it was in many ways the most difficult to write because there was the most to say.
But that was the best. That, in my opinion, that was the best chapter of the book because it was kind of like a history lesson. As I said, it was really you going through and monitoring different trends that have been happening over the last 10, 15 years, and that was great information to be able to read and get better insight on. Because as you said in the book, I won't spoil. I refuse to spoil everything, but the mid range isn't dead. The mid range isn't dead, and I was glad to be able to read more of the backstory on why that was. And I truly thank you for writing such a great book for everybody to be able to read. I can't recommend it enough. I know some people on the No Ceilings team, like Tyler Metcalf, just got his copy of your book in the mail today, and he's excited to read it as I was talking to him about some things. And I couldn't thank you enough, Seth, for wanting to come on my podcast for a little bit and share some insight with me. One more time, if you could tell my audience where they can buy the book, because truly they really should.
People seem to have had the best luck in terms of getting it delivered quickly via either Amazon or direct from the publisher Triumph Books. It's also available in sort of every popular e-reader format if you're into that kind of thing. And I just found out there's not an audiobook available yet. There are talks to do one sometime in the next, I don't know how long. The best news for me as far as that is there's nobody that wants me to actually do the reading of it. I've said this before on other, but if that was a condition of there being an audiobook that I had to read it, there would be no audiobook. Just like it's
Is this a book you really want to listen to as an audiobook, though? I feel like you kind of want to have it in front of you, be able to take notes and jot things down.
Some people, like enough people have asked about an audio format that it's like,
really,
I do not consume analytics content well in audio format, but some people might.
Auditory listeners. I'm not an auditory listener. I do know that. So learner. So, but Seth, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. And thank you everyone out there listening to this episode of the Draft Deeper podcast. If you aren't following me on Twitter already, please do so at Draft Deeper. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and definitely subscribe, stay in touch, stay engaged. There's plenty more draft content coming. We're only approaching Christmas time. We have so much left in the draft process from now until June 23rd, 2022. So definitely stay engaged, stay talking with me. Appreciate all of you listening out there. Thank you so much. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.